Well, thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be back at this great conference. I've been to it several times in Seoul, and it's wonderful to have it come to Washington. We have a fabulous panel for you discussing the alliance and the future for North Korea. I'm David Sanger. I'm the chief Washington correspondent for the New York Times. You have in your books the biographies of our speakers, but I'll just run through and give them a quick introduction so you know who is who. Kim Sung-han, who's immediately to my left, your right as you're viewing us, is the former Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade for the Republic of Korea, and he's a professor of international relations at the Graduate School of International Studies at Korea University. Sitting right next to him is my old friend Michael O'Hanlon, who's a senior fellow at the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence and director for the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. He's also a member of the External Advisory Board at the CIA, and I would list for you what he publishes, but to my horror, he seems to publish about every 3 months, so I can never keep up with Michael. Sitting just next to Michael on the other side is Gary Samore, who's the Executive Director for Research at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Kennedy School of Government, and of course is known well to all of you as President Obama's White House Coordinator for Arms Control and Weapons of Mass Destruction and Terrorism. And just next to Gary is General Walter Sharp, former commander of the United Nations Command in Korea, the United States Combined Forces Command for the Army. He's commanded troops in Desert Shield and Desert Storm, Operation Uphold Democracy in Haiti, and he was also in Bosnia. And finally down at the end is old friend, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Myung Hwan. He is currently senior advisor for the Kim and Chang Law Office, and he teaches at Sejong University as a chair professor. So we thought that for the format today, I'm going to ask each of our panelists a specific question, and we're hoping that we'll have fairly tight answers so that we can have some conversation among all of the panelists and not just prepared remarks. And then we're going to be eager to go to all of you for your questions. You know, I think if this morning's sessions established anything, it's clear that the alliance is stronger today than it has been for some time. The relationship improved significantly during the Bush administration and continued to improve during the Obama administration. And yet, with North Korea, we're in the situation where across 2 administrations, they've now set off 3 nuclear tests, a whole series of missile tests, and of course have gone into the cycle that is so familiar to us now, which is a nuclear or missile test and then an entry into negotiations in return for some set of concessions, whether it is food or an energy program, and then when things fall apart, we go into the cycle all over again. This is what led Bob Gates, the former Secretary of Defense, at the end of the Bush administration, and of course stayed on through the first 2 years of the Obama administration, to make his famous comment that he'd bought that horse before several times. So one of the objectives of our panel here today is to try to emerge from this with some lessons about how one can make progress on this without getting caught in the cycle and without buying the same horse all over again. So let's start first with you, Professor Kim. If you had to draw some pithy lessons from the past 20 years across Democratic and Republican administrations, where I would say the success level of the different approaches they have tried has been about the same, or lack of success in terms of constraining North Korea's arms programs, what would those lessons be?
Oh.
Is it working?
Okay.
Out of our try and error for the past 20 years,
since 1993 when the first nuclear crisis came about. I think we can draw approximately 5 lessons for our KU-US alliance in dealing with North Korea. I think the first lesson we can draw is that it is extremely hard for us to expect North Korea to give up its nuclear weapons as long as North Korean leadership believes nuclear weapons are the survival kit for their regime. That's why we have to continue to try to talk to the North while implementing vigorously UN sanctions against North Korea, which means North Korea wouldn't give up its nuclear weapons until they believe their regime survival is completely assured or their regime survival is seriously threatened. And the second lesson is that we have to maintain international unity. North Korea has been trying to drive a wedge between Korea and the U.S. In the 1990s, and Korea, Japan, and South Korea in the 2000s, particularly since 2002, and now driving a wedge among U.S., China, and South Korea. That's why we have to intensively consult with China so that China may be able to influence North Korea so that we can take a kind of a turning point for the North Korean nuclear problem solving. And the third lesson is a nuclear North Korea does not serve Chinese national interest, let alone others. As you may have seen already, China appears to be recalculating its North Korea policy, probably because North Korea's nuclear problem does not serve Chinese interests as long as China wants continued cooperation with the United States, and as long as China wants to let Japan down. From this perspective, I think previously some Chinese leaders believed a nuclear North Korea would be better than the collapse of North Korea. But now, apparently, many of Chinese leaders believe nuclear North Korea is equally bad as the collapse of North Korea, at least.
Mr. Kim, let me just ask you on that point, because I think you raise a very interesting issue. Do they believe that because the facts have changed, or they believe that because it's a new generation of Chinese leaders who simply don't have the emotional connection to North Korea?
North Korean nuclear problem has gotten seriously. In my judgment, China tended to underestimate North Korean nuclear capability until the second nuclear test. But since that time on, China has come to believe North Korean nuclear capability is not to be ignored, which means it is getting more and more serious. And also it is impacting upon Chinese relationship with the United States as well as Japan. So that's why.
I interrupted you, but please go on to your fourth.
And the fourth lesson is that peace regime, North Korea has been consistently and persistently talking about the need to set up a permanent peace regime on the Korean Peninsula by signing on a treaty with the United States, as if U.S. and North Korea peace treaty were a kind of a game changer for resolving the nuclear problem. By the way, we all know that this is a typical North Korean propaganda strategy. That's why ROK and the United States need to remind North Korea of the fact that the 2005 September 19th joint statement says that at some point in the future, we can resume kind of permanent peace talks whenever necessary. But when there is a progress in the six-party talks. So we can start peace forum right after the six-party talks has been resumed. But I believe the progress or the discussions on the peace regime building should be linked with the progress on the nuclear talks, not the other way around. Last lesson is that U.S. and Korea should go beyond deterrence and defense vis-à-vis North Korea and try to come up with the ways of realizing peaceful unification of the Korean Peninsula, which means we need to go beyond a somewhat narrow perspective of looking at North Korean problem from just non-proliferation perspective. We need to go beyond that to explore the ways of realizing Korean unification. Only when Korean people, particularly the South Korean people, have recognized the fact that the United States has contributed to the Korean unification, will they support continued ROK-US alliance even after Korean unification?
Well, thank you very much. Those 5 points, I think, really helped get us rolling. And General Sharp, let me take you straight to Mr. Kim's last point there, because when I would come out and visit you at the command, the briefings we would get from your incredibly talented staff out there were all a little bit on the passive side of what you would do if an incident broke out and how you set up the conditions for peaceful unification, as Mr. Kim said. But there are some who believe that, in fact, what the United States, part of the failure of the United States policy so far and South Korea's policy is that it has been too passive, that one has to promote or force a change. That's something that was a battle that went on throughout the Bush administration. And it's never really been a resolved issue within the Obama administration, although I wouldn't say that there has been the kind of fireworks over it that you saw during the Bush era. So what would need to be done if you really wanted to force change?
Thanks, David. And I do believe we're at a point where we need to start forcing a change in North Korea. Continue the pressure to help encourage them to change, but history shows that's not going to work. So I've got a couple steps that I believe that are necessary to start forcing a change, and they're really whole of alliance steps that would help move in that direction. I think first off, diplomatically, we need to discuss between the United States, the Republic of Korea, China, and Japan, what does a reunified peninsula really look like? Where are U.S. forces? What are the property rights? What type of government is up there? What happens to the North Korean military after a reunification? And I think working together, we can come up with a construct of a reunified peninsula that increases and enhances the vital national of all of the region to include China. So have an end state in mind. Secondly, I think we need to be much more vocal on the human rights violations that are going on in North Korea and what they're doing, and the provocations, and not just do it periodically, but have a constant drumbeat to go in and make sure the world understands that North Korea is indeed the country that has the most human rights violations of anywhere in the world. I would really encourage ASEAN and others to start forming Track 2 type of forums like this, where we can talk among each other about what does a reunified peninsula look like. Number 3 is informationally. I think that we ought to have a much stronger effort, I could even argue an initial effort, to start getting information into the people, into the military of North Korea, as to what human rights, as outlined by the United Nations, are, and how their government does not abide by any of those human rights articles that are in the United Nations. and make it clear to the people and state it's our goal is just to get information on the truth, on human rights, on freedom, on democracy into the people, into the military of North Korea, so that they could start seeing what isolation has done to them over the past 60 years. And then finally, militarily. Those first steps will cause problems to Kim Jong-un, and they will cause unrest that he could possibly strike out. So it has to be countered with a stronger military, a stronger deterrence. And I think we've started down that process with a provocation plan, the counter-provocation plan that is now in place, because I'm absolutely convinced if there's another attack on South Korea like there was in November 2010, the response going back to North Korea will be swift and very, very strong and very, very punishing. But we need to continue to enhance that plan. And then finally, militarily, to continue to enhance the missile defense, to enhance ISR intelligence and surveillance. I applaud South Korea looking very hard at buying Global Hawk. Applaud them at looking at the next strike fighter so that we can go in and to be able to quickly take things out of North Korea if necessary. So it's a whole of government, a whole of alliance approach that takes us beyond just hoping for a change, encouraging a change, and tips the balance to now forcing a change.
Well, thanks very much for your comments, General Sharp. I think maybe the best person to sort of pick that up and comment on it might be Minister Yu. Because when you were foreign minister, my recollection is that you were obviously pulling together a policy that was significantly more aggressive than the previous administrations. And yet you couldn't quite get to uttering the words that you just heard from General Sharp. In other words, that regime change was not within the sort of diplomatic language that even the administration you were representing was discussing. So, as my question is, if the objective here is to solve the nuclear issue, can you do it by going back to negotiation, or do you need to go to a plan that is some variant of what you just heard from General Sharp?
Well, before answering your question, let me say a few words. As we all agree that Korea-U.S. alliance is at its strongest, a point that has been thoroughly demonstrated by the recent visit of the President Park Geun-hye. But both of the countries made a terrible mistake. I mean that we failed to achieve denuclearization of North Korea. I don't want to say who is to blame more, but South Korean government has been a little bit complacent, lacking coherent strategy, lacking consensus, and sometimes our policy toward North Korea has been zigzagging. Also, United States government has been complacent, believing that diplomatic negotiation will work, will solve the nuclearization of North Korea. But as we all know, we failed. During the last 20 years, in retrospect, North Korea has lied again and again. Then what is the other option? And I may suggest that from now on, the United States and South Korean government has to draw up a very workable and detailed strategy to achieve unification. I think that's the only way to solve this conundrum and make it as a primary objective of our alliance. And later this week, President Park Geun-hye will visit China and will meet with Xi Jinping. And she has important task to convey. That is a unified nuclear-free peninsula will benefit long-term strategic interest of China. And also, the United States has to say to Chinese that with the continued nuclear development of North Korea, it would be China that would suffer more strategic loss than the United States. And as China grows bigger and bigger, and to the extent they claim the equal, the footing with the United States, the strategic value of North Korea as a buffer zone for China will decrease. And in a not too distant future, the North Korea will become more of a liability as opposed to strategic asset of China. So just as the Cold War ended with the unification of Germany, the beginning of the Asia-Pacific era of 21st century must start with the unified Korean Peninsula. That is my answer to your question.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Yu. Gary, you and I have been talking about what the various objectives should be in discussions with North Korea for, well, I'd say how many years, but people would figure out how old we are out of this now. But it's been a long time. And we're just at that cusp right now where after what was an extremely tense spring, it's looking like China could well convene another set of six-party talks. The United States will go to them. You have the risk of being right back in the same cycle. In the interim, we had the North Koreans say, as Mr. Kim pointed out in his first comments, that they weren't interested in denuclearizing the peninsula anymore. Now, I always wondered if that with the six-party talks, people always say, this is all about denuclearization. If it's suddenly you've got one party that said they're not interested in denuclearization, is this worth doing again? And if so, what should the objectives be?
Well, I agree with Minister Yu that it's not practical to expect that we can achieve nuclear disarmament through diplomacy, at least as long as the current leadership is in power in Pyongyang, and unless there's a fundamental change in Chinese strategy, which I haven't seen. So if we do resume a diplomatic process, whether it's a bilateral U.S. DPRK or six-party talks, and I suspect that's where we're headed. I think the North Koreans are capable of changing their rhetoric in a way that would meet a commitment to talk about denuclearization based on the September 2005 agreement and stop talking about their legitimate rights as a nuclear weapon state. Even if they don't mean it, they're likely to meet some diplomatic formula for resuming negotiations. If that's the case, and if disarmament is not really a near-term goal that can be achieved, of course, we'll continue to say that's the ultimate objective, but we should also be thinking about what interim measures would constrain or limit the nuclear and missile program. And of course, that's the approach that was followed by the last three U.S. administrations. They all reached agreement with North Korea on interim steps, which they thought would limit the nuclear program. And the key, it seems to me, since looks like we're going back into the same cycle again, is A, you have to be confident that you're really getting what you pay for. So verification is absolutely essential. We have to be sure that whatever we give the North Koreans in exchange for limits, they have to be ones where we think we're really getting a genuine agreement and that we have some mechanism to catch them if they cheat again. And B, I think we have to...
Can I just stop you on that one? Because until now, the IAEA, of course, has been limited just to being at Yongbyon. But as we all know, the uranium enrichment program you suspect is elsewhere. So when you say there's got to be a real verification, of course, you mean well beyond Yongbyon.
Absolutely. And it seems to me that the maximum objective we can try to achieve is a freeze on fissile material production. And that would be significant, obviously, because it would limit the amount of fissile material North Korea has available for its nuclear weapons program or for export. The only way to be confident that we have actually capped the enrichment program is a full declaration from North Korea backed by very intrusive inspections. Now, I'm skeptical the North Koreans would agree to that kind of a mechanism, but we shouldn't pay very much for a phony freeze. If it's just a freeze of the facilities at Yongbyon, you're not actually getting a real freeze, and so therefore, to me, I wouldn't pay much of a price in order to achieve that. So that's the maximum objective, and I think we should hold out significant sanctions relief and negotiation of a peace treaty and other things the North Koreans want for a verified freeze, knowing that we're unlikely to achieve it. The lesser objective, and I think the one that is probably more attainable, is to prevent or at least delay the next round of nuclear and missile tests. I think that's easier to achieve because A, it's easy to verify. We know whether they test nuclear devices or long-range rockets, so verification is built into it. B, I think the Chinese are very frustrated and angry, especially with the last round of testing, and so we can count on them to support us in terms of trying to achieve that objective. And finally, I think it's quite significant technically. Every time North Korea tests, they come closer to perfecting devices. We can't measure exactly, but we know it helps them to miniaturize devices. And until they test a long-range missile capable of hitting the United States, they really haven't achieved an ICBM capability. So we shouldn't, it seems to me, we shouldn't minimize the value of postponing as long as we can the next round of rocket or nuclear. Recognizing that any deal we have with North Korea is likely to fall apart in the end, either because they cheat or they renege on it, and we'll be back in the same cycle as we've seen so many times before, of provocation. But that's the nature of the regime, and that's not going to change until the regime changes.
Let me finish this round with you, Michael, because you've now heard a fairly pessimistic run. I mean, if I had to draw a theme out of all this group, it's, yeah, we can go back into negotiations, but if you think about the 5 lessons we heard about from Mr. Kim, if you think about the warning we heard about from General Sharp that one needs to try to force change, if you think about Minister Yu's and Gary's comments on where the objectives here have to change to areas where we think the North Koreans are unlikely to go do this. I guess my question to you is, are there things that you can think of that the U.S. can do and South Korea can do, either unilaterally or bilaterally, that would keep you out of the cycle that clearly everybody here believes we may well be falling back to?
Yeah, David, great questions, and it's an honor to be on this panel and celebrating the alliance with so many distinguished friends. Just a couple of thoughts. One is that I do think we have to bear in mind the long-term goal is to get to a broader dialogue with North Korea about reform that has to include economics and has to move them in a Vietnam-like or China-like direction. They're not ready for that. Their current leader is not ready for that in terms of what he appears to prefer. He certainly is not ready for that in terms of his political clout within his own country. And we've got to remember we're dealing with a